go ahead and get started. First, are there any bill introductions this morning? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and move on to the items on the agenda for today. First is going to be an update on the status of the Budget Stabilization Fund, also referred to as the Rainy Day Fund. And so I would ask Amy Deckert with Legislative Research to give us that update. Amy.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. You should have a blue memo from us on your desk describing the Budget Stabilization Fund, which was created by the 2016 legislature. That bill also charged the Legislative Budget Committee with developing and recommending a method to fund the Stabilization Fund. This has been funded a variety of ways, including in fiscal year 2020, 50% of state general fund receipts that exceeded the consensus revenue estimates were transferred from the state general fund to the Budget Stabilization Fund. That totaled $81.9 million. That $81.9 million was ultimately transferred back to the state general fund via proviso at a later date. That was due to the governor recommending that transfer due to anticipated shortfalls due to the pandemic. That transfer back happened by an act of appropriation in 2022. The governor also recommended suspending transfers from the state general fund to the budget stabilization for 2021. So to set that stage, the balance of the Budget Stabilization Fund at the beginning of fiscal year 2022 was $0. The 2022 legislature ultimately transferred $500 million from the state general fund to the Budget Stabilization Fund in House Sub for Sub 4 SB 267, and then transferred an additional $250 million in the Omnibus Appropriation Bill, or HB 2510, for a total of $750 million in legislatively directed transfers in last fiscal year. In addition to those transfers, actual SGF receipts in fiscal year 2022 exceeded consensus revenue estimate projections by $438.1 million. So half of that excess was transferred at the end of fiscal year 2022. So that's a transfer of $219.1 million. So that means there was a total transfer at the end of the fiscal year of $969.1 million. In addition, you allowed the Budget Stabilization Fund to retain the interest based on the average daily balance rate. So the balance as of this month is $980.2 million in the Rainy Day Fund. On the back, just want to remind you that it can be expended solely by an act of appropriation of the legislature or by the State Finance Council as an act of legislative delegation. Also want to note that the governor's budget recommendation does include transferring $500 million from the state general fund into the Budget Stabilization Fund in fiscal year 2023. In addition, the governor's recommendation includes a proposal to cap transfers based on the consensus revenue estimates into the Budget Stabilization Fund at 15% of actual SGF tax receipts. In addition, the governor's recommendation also proposes a language change to separate the Budget Stabilization Fund from the 7.5% ending balance requirement of the State General Fund. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Amy. So on the back page of the information that you supplied to us, can you elaborate on the differences on the last two statements of each paragraph, where the Budget Stabilization Fund shall not be considered as part of the ending balance of the State General Fund for the purposes of the governor's allotment authority? And the governor is also proposing a language change to separate the Budget Stabilization Fund from the 7.5% ending balance.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. So the governor's allotment authority includes provisions differing depending on the estimated ending balance. Statutorily, that excludes any references to the Rainy Day Fund. So there could still be a balance in the Rainy Day Fund, and the governor could utilize the allotment process. Separately, the 7.5% ending balance, currently statute does allow the governor to utilize the rainy day fund towards the 7.5% ending balance when submitting her budget.
All right, thank you. Committee, are there any questions for Amy in regards to the Budget Stabilization Fund? Representative Rajas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because when I saw this earlier, I'm not sure if I think I'm missing something. I don't fully understand because it looks like it's kind of an either or. Is that right? I mean, you can or the governor can or can't use it when determining the budget request. Is that right?
Amy?
Mr. Chairman, so statutorily, the governor has to submit a budget that has a 7.5% ending balance. Currently, the governor could utilize the rainy day fund to hit that 7.5% ending balance. My understanding of the governor's proposal is she wants to introduce legislation to eliminate that as an option. But I would, of course, defer to the governor's office to clarify their proposal.
I think I still kind of get it, but I'll learn more from the governor's office on exactly what they want.
Any further questions for Amy? All right, seeing none. Thank you very much. Oh, Representative Sutton? All right. You'll have opportunity to ask questions in the future. All right. You know, we don't have quotas. But all right, we'll go ahead and now we'll move on to an update on the Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansas and the other COVID-19 expenditures and money that was received by the state of Kansas. And so I would ask Ethan Belshie, the Director of Public Affairs with the Office of Recovery, to address the committee. And you're just going to be talking about what I call Spark 2.0, right? Yes. All right. All right, thank you, Ethan.
Is it on now? Okay, awesome. Good morning, Chair Waymaster and members of the committee. As the chair said, my name is Ethan Belshie, and I am the Director of Public Affairs for the Office of Recovery. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today and provide an update on COVID-19 relief funds from the American Rescue Plan Act and recent action taken on those funds by the Spark Executive Committee and the State Finance Council. Prior to diving into that discussion, I do want to take a few minutes to provide just a general refresher on the Office of Recovery and the COVID-19 relief funds that we'll be talking about today. As you'll see on slide 2 of the deck that was provided as testimony, the Office of Recovery was created in the spring of 2020 in response to the influx of COVID-19 relief funds that the state received from the federal government's response to the pandemic. The RO is responsible for administering, monitoring, and reporting the use of these funds while providing informational and organizational support to the Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansas, or SPARK, process through which Kansas's discretionary relief funds are distributed. Initially, the Office of Recovery focused on the administration and monitoring of relief funds provided to Kansas through the 2020 Federal CARES Act, and then the subsequent passage of the Federal Consolidated Appropriations Act in December 2020 and the American Rescue Plan Act in March 2021 allocated additional federal relief dollars to Kansas. The RO has provided ongoing support to entities that receive these funds, including state agencies and local governments. The Office of Recovery support consists of technical assistance and guidance regarding compliance, reporting, and usage of these funds. There are significant federal allowability rules and restrictions around how these funds can be used, and our office's role is to provide general administrative oversight and to help entities understand and abide by these federal rules. Moving to slide 3, you'll see that the Office of Recovery has also assisted in supporting the SPARK process through which discretionary relief funds, like the ones I will discuss today, were distributed. Kansas received approximately $1.54 billion in discretionary state fiscal recovery funds, or SFRF, through the American Rescue Plan Act. The 7-member bipartisan Spark Executive Committee, made up of representatives from the executive branch, legislative branch, and the private sector, was appointed to make recommendations on the distribution of these funds, subject to the approval of the State Finance Council. On December 21st, 2022, the State Finance Council approved a total of $374 million in SFRF relief funds for broadband infrastructure and adoption, the modernization and improvement of government services, economic development, and health and education initiatives that were recommended by the Spark Executive Committee. The portfolio of approved funding included competitive grant programs in the 4 Spark Advisory Panel areas, which are connectivity or broadband, efficiency and modernization, health and education, and economic revitalization. The approved programs in each area, I will briefly walk through those now. So there was a total of $35 million approved for 2 programs in the connectivity space. This included $30 million for a broadband infrastructure program and $5 million for a broadband adoption and enablement program. There were 2 programs approved in the efficiency and modernization space. One at $95 million, the State Efficiency and Modernization Program, which will invest in state facilities, IT, continuity of operations, and safety and security to enhance services to Kansans. And then an additional $5 million in this space was allocated to a local safety and security equipment program. There was a total of $109 million approved for health and education across 3 programs. This included $66 million for a health facilities and program expansion program, $38 million for a child care and community resource capacity accelerator program, and $5 million for an early childhood data integration and system enhancements program. The largest bucket of approved funds was in economic revitalization, and there are 6 programs there. The first is $50 million for the BASE program, which we are calling BASE 2.0. This will essentially be a second round of funding for the BASE program. $30 million for a tourism program, $10 million for a housing program, $20 million for an aviation and aerospace workforce program, $10 million for a workforce program aimed at high-needs industries, and then $10 million for a small-town water and sewer infrastructure assistance program. An overview of each of these approved programs, including program descriptions, target outcomes, and other details, is available in the deck on slides 6 through 27. Our office is now working with the agencies administering these programs to finalize program design details and application processes. Additional details on these competitive grant funding opportunities, including information on the timeline and process for entities to apply for funds, will be forthcoming from administering agencies by the end of February. I'd note that per the recommendation of the Spark Executive Committee, these funding opportunities will be communicated broadly to interested parties, including industry groups and the media, with the intent to solicit as much participation in these grant opportunities as possible. Entities that previously submitted a proposal to the Spark process will be notified of funding opportunities relevant to their proposal once those details are available. Additionally, I'd note that there will be no limitation on who can apply for these programs based on prior submission of proposals to the Spark process. As I said, our office is working to get these programs stood up as expeditiously as possible. The BASE 2.0 program and application was released by the Department of Commerce earlier this month, and the State Efficiency and Modernization Program is already underway. We expect more program announcements to be made in the weeks to come. Before wrapping up, I'd note that in addition to the $374 million that was approved this past December, both the Legislature and Spark allocated SFRF dollars throughout 2021 and 2022, And an accounting of all of these allocations of Spark dollars is available in the appendix of my testimony. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Ethan. So the first question I have is, you had mentioned that base 2.0, which was building a stronger economy, which was introduced last year. Those applications, were they due January 13th?
The application deadline for that program is the end of the month, I believe, so entities have until January 31st to get their applications in. Additionally, anyone that submitted an application in the first round of BASE that was not funded, that application will remain in the running, and those entities have been given the opportunity to update their application if they want, just given the amount of time since the first round of funding.
But were there not some applications that needed to be submitted by last Friday?
That there were, and that was for the State Efficiency and Modernization Program. Those applications were due this past Friday, and our office was in pretty much constant contact with the state entities that were eligible for that program, including state agencies, non-cabinet agencies, judicial branch, legislative branch. And the intent of the pretty quick timeline with that is so that those entities can know if they're going to be getting any funding through these programs ahead of the legislative budget process really kicking off.
So the next question I have, and actually we have 3 members on this committee that served as the chairpersons for the advisory panels, Representative Tarwater, Representative Williams, and myself. And I know that the main focus that we had when we were looking at the proposals that were submitted was one-time expenditures, making sure that this was not a long-term existing financial burden on the state budget. However, there were some concerns when we had the State Finance Council meeting that some could evolve into a long-term expenditure. Can you elaborate on that?
No, certainly, and I think that's a very valid concern. You know, these are federal funds, so it's just one-time money, and so, you know, we heard throughout the process, both from the executive committee, from the advisory panel, from some of the public listening sessions that were held, that, you know, a real priority is making sure that this isn't going to create an ongoing burden for the state. And so we took that into mind as we are working with the various agencies that are administering these programs. And so that's something that we've emphasized to them and that, you know, will be taken into consideration when these grants are received and reviewed.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ethan. Committee, any questions for Ethan? Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of piggybacking on what you said, there were several committees that met throughout all of last year, and there were some pretty high-power, very talented people on those committees all across the state. And they poured through all these applications and spent a lot of time deliberating and made some suggestions. Why were they all disregarded?
So the recommendations of the advisory panels, those were taken into consideration when these program proposals were formulated and presented to the executive committee. The intent was to use the expertise and knowledge and all of the time and energy that the advisory panels put into this process throughout last year to try and shape programs that would meet some of those same needs that the advisory panels had identified through that process.
Representative Tarwater.
Was the Executive Spark Committee involved in that decision, or did it come from the administration?
Ethan.
So the executive committee ultimately did approve this slate of competitive grant programs. There was a lot of discussion in meetings throughout the process, and ultimately the executive committee did opt to recommend a slate of programs rather than picking and choosing individual projects that were submitted as idea submissions to the advisory panel process.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was my understanding from some of the members on the executive committee that this was just kind of given to them as the only option. And I don't believe that was the intent of this. And that seems to be kind of how things run around here these days is we've got to just take what we're given in the legislative process. We're supposed to be the ones that appropriate the funds, and I would like to keep it that way. Thank you.
Any other questions for Ethan? Representative Corbett.
Thank you, sir. Can you tell me roughly how many billions of dollars was kind of showered on Candace for this COVID projects?
Yes, so there was a significant amount of funding that was provided throughout the various relief bills. I can provide kind of a breakdown of some of the exact numbers, but you are correct that it's multiple billions. I believe in the American Rescue Plan Act alone, through both funds that went to individuals and then funds that were appropriated for programs, there was something like 6 or 7 billion total that was provided to Kansas. And so I'm happy to provide a more thorough breakdown as a follow-up for the committee.
One of the numbers I heard was over 30 billion. Is there any, but could you get back to the committee on that? Because I heard it was quite a bit of money.
Absolutely, sir. Yes.
And kind of like a historical perspective in regards to the discretionary fund. So we do have the numbers on that, Representative Corbett, on how much totally was received by either individuals, businesses, local forms of government, the state entities, in regards to how much was received, not only in ARPA, but also in CARES 1 and CARES 2. We do have those numbers because we had that actually presented to us in the Legislative Budget Committee. But then to think about what we did in 2020, was it 2020 or 2021? In regards to CARES, for CARES 1, the state had discretionary funds of $1.2 billion at that point. However, the condition by the federal government was that we had to spend that $1.2 billion by December 30th of 2020. Even though that was extended later on, the state of Kansas had already expended all that money by that point. After the extension was already granted for the states to have more time in order to spend that money, which I've expressed to our federal partners that you're only allowing us to make poor decisions when you ask us to spend that amount of money in a short period of time. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I want to ask a few questions related to the health and education. There was $109 million allotted for that. And originally, the applications came in, I believe, early 2021 for those. Do you remember how many applications there were for individual projects?
I don't off the top of my head, Representative. I'm sorry. But I would say certainly, over 100 in that space. In total, I believe we received around 850 idea submissions in early 2021 or early 2022 when that call went out. And I think the majority of those were economic revitalization, but health and education was certainly the second most popular area, if you will.
Yes, I think, I don't recall the exact number, but I think it was a few hundred, and the amount of information that was submitted was tremendous, and the amount of time that it took to go through each one of those applications, and then providing that information to the Spark Executive Committee, and then now we're getting a report back. So can you maybe go over again how or when on this timeline that specific selections will be made?
Yes, so in terms of individual projects or grant awards, that's really going to be kind of on a program by program basis. We're working with the agencies administering these programs to get things stood up as quickly as possible because, we certainly recognize that this has been a long process and that folks are very interested in these opportunities. And so while we do have to keep federal allowability rules in mind and make sure everything is above board on that, we are working, and our intent is to get program announcements, which would include information about timelines for when applications would be opening by the end of February at the absolute latest.
So you're going to request new applications beyond the applications that were already submitted just for these specific areas that were already originally included. Is that what I'm understanding?
So this will be a new application process. As we're working with these agencies, our intent is to make sure that the applications are, using the information or making it so that entities can use the same information that they submitted for their idea submissions with this application process. Unfortunately, one of the pieces of the federal rules is that when something like this goes out to grant, it has to be an open application process. And so as part of that, the idea submissions do not have enough information, and it was not an official application process in the sense of a grant award, which is why there's going to be this new round of applications.
Representative Williams?
Okay, what I reviewed was quite detailed and took a great deal of time talking to individuals across the state about their projects. And now what I'm hearing, all of those are now set aside. Has there been posted or has a response been made to those applicants who are still confused? Are they still eligible? Could they receive funding? Has there been any communication from the Office of Recovery to those applicants, hundreds of applicants, 800 overall, a couple hundred for this category? Has there been an email or a response to them that said, you will not be receiving this?
Ethan?
So we have worked to try and keep folks, involved in this process as much as possible. We have a newsletter that goes out biweekly that we've been putting out with updates about this process as it's gone on. And so when these programs were approved, that update was included and included information around how the application process will be working moving forward. And, we're committed to, once these programs are open and once we have the details about how these application processes will work, we will be reaching back out to all of those idea submitters that might be eligible for these programs to make sure they're aware of this opportunity and to make sure they're able to apply.
Okay, so I want to extend off of her question. So when we had the idea submissions by the applicants, which, were totaling 850 total across the state of Kansas, and then they were scored on a matrix, and they were allowable, likely allowable, somewhat allowable, not likely allowable, not allowable. So at the time that they were scored, and let's say they were likely not allowable or not allowable, were they contacted that they did not meet the specifications of the federal dollars?
I don't believe there was a specific communication at that time around the allowability. But again, at that time in the advisory panel process, we weren't sure of the specifics of what future funding opportunities would look like. In retrospect, that might have been a useful thing to do to help keep folks apprised of that allowability piece of it.
Representative Williams?
So on that note, I don't know if it's appropriate, Chairman, but the request should be from our committee and perhaps Sir Chairman, that those applicants be contacted. And for me, when people come to me and I don't know, and I was a member of that committee, then something fell short. The other thing that fell short is that we're a year out of $109 million sitting on a shelf. If it really was needed, then why did we wait and have one round of applications, throw it in the trash, and have a second round of applications that we have to start all over from? That is very frustrating. Yes, disrespectful. And secondly, I look at the list, the change, and we're looking at childcare, and we all know that we have this great childcare facility need, but really it's a staffing need. Last week, we heard that there's 2.5 job openings for every one person that could fill them. So how we're going to build facilities for childcare with this $109 million, but we don't have people? What is that plan? I mean, that doesn't even make sense to me. And bottom line, I don't see anything in here about trying to clean up a regulatory system for our child care that makes it improbable, implausible, impractical for somebody to go into that for a for-profit business. You'd have to be not-for-profit if you wanted to start that. So very disappointed in the fact that, and thank you for bringing it back to our committee, but very disappointed that we wasted our entire year on this and that committee was a waste of my time. Thank you.
Ethan, did you want to respond?
I would just say I certainly understand the frustration, and it was certainly a longer process than we anticipated when the Spark 2.0 process kicked off, and that's why we are moving forward as quickly as we can.
Representative Landwehr.
Mr. Chairman, I'm struggling with the idea that the administration is making this complete decision. I've never, ever, in all my years, seen this. Back when the year we ended up with ARA funds, it was done and driven and handled legislative. The legislature in Kansas constitutionally controls the funds, not the administration. I was not a part of this process, but I would be as upset as my colleague here had I spent my year devoting my time, all of these people across Kansas that thought they were in line for something, to find out that no, they weren't. They were discarded and thrown in the trash. This is not the administration's money, people. This is taxpayer dollars, period, simple. And we're not listening to the taxpayers. This committee had that opportunity to do this, that Representative Tarwater and Waymaster and Williams was on. But they were ignored. So we have just ignored, this administration has just ignored the people of Kansas. This is despicable. You're just the messenger. I'm not jumping on you personally. But the administration needs to come and answer to us as to why this decision was made to ignore the people of Kansas and all the people across the state that worked on this, to have their work thrown in the trash. I don't think that, we need to figure out if there's any way possible to stop the allocations of these funds, Mr. Chairman. This should not move forward. We need to find out why we're discarding Kansans. Am I upset? Yes.
I can tell. The allocation for those funds were specified in the budget bill that was set up with the Spark committee process, and then the final allocation was then approved by the State Finance Council, and so it was passed in the budget bill. Very similar to what was done and what was the streamlined process with the CARES Act money. I tend to agree with you. Because a lot of the deliberations and the meetings that we had in regards to the advisory panel that I chaired, I just found out a couple weeks ago that one of the items that we specifically wanted to have addressed, now that particular group is told, you no longer qualify. And that's what we actually set the money up for. And now they're being told, no, there's no reason to apply because you don't follow the guidelines. And that was something that was never passed through by the advisory panel for efficiency and modernization. And I contend with your frustration as well. Representative Landwehr.
So, Mr. Chairman, in that process that was laid out, was the full authority then given to the administration to do these funds? Did we hand over our authority? Is that what I'm being told here? Is that the process that was just told to us? Is this the process that we laid out in our budget? If it's not, it needs to stop.
I would need to confirm with Jill on exactly what the wording was in the budget bill. But it was set up in the budget bill that if we had any money that was received by the federal government, it went through the Spark Executive Committee, and then they decided to set up the advisory panels, make recommendations to the Spark Executive Committee. The Spark Executive Committee then made recommendations to the State Finance Council, and the State Finance Council, while the legislature was out of session, had the final approval on the decisions that were made by the Spark Executive Committee. But I would defer to Jill. All right. Representative Helgerson.
I've stayed away from this topic, but I'll remind the committee, when we had this discussion, when we had all these funds coming in front of us, I stayed over in that chair and literally said on half a dozen times that we were giving away the appropriation process to a committee that was not supposed to be making this decision. It was only supposed to be making that decision when we were not in session, and that we should grab the reins back of those funds and never let the money out of this committee. And the Appropriation Committee and the Ways and Means Committee and the entire legislature gave away its responsibility at that time for an executive branch function. And, you know, we're going to have this discussion several more times, but I just simply remind the committee, we had this discussion and I spoke at length about the fears that I had that have come to fruition. And, you know, I don't know if my colleague from Sedgwick County and the chairman had any discussion, but anytime we want to pull the money back into this committee, I'll probably support it or stop the funds. But I don't know if you can do it at this point with it already in the appropriation process and already doled out to the executive branch. So.
Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Helgerson, I'd be happy to work on whatever that language needs to be and see what we can do. My request to the Office of Recovery is, and I would assume it could be done by the end of this week, is to supply us with all the email addresses of those individuals that applied in that first round that have now been thrown in the trash, basically. And we will respond to each and every one of them to make sure that they know that their requests are no longer valid. Because it sounds like to me, you guys have not done that. Am I correct?
Ethan.
We have done outreach to those that submitted idea submissions throughout this process, but we are certainly happy to provide that list. We have it on file for each of the 4 advisory panels and happy to get that to the committee.
My question was, and the answer I heard earlier is now different than the answer you just gave. Did the Department of Recovery or anyone else, I don't want semantics in this, send an email to every one of those individuals to let them know that their request was no longer valid, that if they were interested in pursuing their request, that they had to resubmit under your new guidelines? Has that been done or not? Yes or no?
Ethan?
That's a simple question.
That has not been done yet.
I am, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not going to belabor it, but I am just absolutely appalled. And the people of Kansas, to be disrespected like this is beyond shameful, absolutely beyond shameful. All my years up here, and I've served under Republican and Democrat governors, I have never, ever seen this type of disrespect for the people of Kansas. Not even responding to them. Thank you.
And I would go on Representative Landwehr's comments, and I would think that it was only prudent that if an entity had submitted an application and it was deemed not allowable under the federal guidelines, we should have reached out and let them know that their application was I guess in essence, denied. And I don't think it's, I see you.
No, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get it.
Oh. And so I would say in regards to responding out to the applicants who would fall within the federal guidelines for the ARPA funds, we need to let them know that you can reapply and update your application. But if there is no point and having an application sent in again and having that entity or individual or business, in essence, what Representative Landwehr said, waste their time again. We need to let them know that we received the application within the particular advisory panel. It was deemed that it was not following the federal guidelines, and that way they don't waste more effort in regards to this if they're going to just be denied again. That'd be my suggestion.
That certainly makes sense. Thank you.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I need a clarification because I've been hearing from the left, but I'm not sure what it is. So you had a panel. Okay. Who made the decision once the panel gave their recommendations? Who made the decision to not follow up on those recommendations?
Ethan.
So the slate of approved programs was approved by the Spark Executive Committee. So it was ultimately their final decision as to what was approved and was recommended to the State Finance Council.
And may I ask the question?
Yes.
In the bill and in the guidelines, was it designated as to who was actually going to be making the recommendations, and did it have to go to Spark, and did Spark had to intervene in it, or how was it laid out?
So
The chain of command I'm asking about.
yes, I believe what was actually included in the budget bill was just the Spark Executive Committee and the State Finance Council approval piece. The advisory panel process was something that was approved by the Executive Committee that was not included in legislation. And so that advisory panel process piece of it was not included in the budget bill.
Man. I won't ask him to repeat it again. I'm sorry you're on the hot seat, but you are standing there. And I think people need to understand, because in listening to it, I don't understand how the process was, and I wasn't on the committee. But I do know that I'm on several committees, CANCARE being the larger one, and we make our recommendations and we follow through. But there's no one else to intervene and say this can't happen and not consider our recommendations. Ultimately made the decision to close down the first proposal and then open it up again. It couldn't have been a committee. I mean, who made the ultimate decision?
Ethan.
So the executive committee was the entity charged with making the recommendations for how to spend these funds. The executive committee created the advisory panel process. The advisory panels made their recommendations, and then the executive committee is what ultimately approved, or made the recommendation, I should say, for the programs that were then approved by the State Finance Council.
Representative Ballard.
Okay, so ultimately, it was the Finance Council, you're saying, that made the decision. Now, Finance Council.
The State Finance Council made the ultimate decision that was given to the State Finance Council by the Executive Committee. The Executive Committee actually made their recommendations to the State Finance Council. So when all the advisory panels came back with their recommendations, we were far over the $374 million that was remaining with the American Rescue Plan Act money. I can't remember the dollar amount that all the four advisory panels came together, but I think it was like around $800 million.
Yep.
And so the executive committee for Spark then went through that, and then they reduced the amounts. Like, I'll take connectivity for one example. I mean, they had a request of, I think it was about $180 million in regards to broadband access across the state of Kansas. We have the infrastructure bill that has been passed by Congress, awaiting to see how much the state of Kansas is going to be receiving in regards to the specificity of broadband that was passed with the infrastructure bill. So the executive committee made the decision of saying, okay, for the connectivity advisory panel, we're going to reduce that to $30 million because we're anticipating this dollar amount coming from the federal government. So the Spark Executive Committee was making adjustments during the meeting, because actually I listened to that particular Spark Executive Committee meeting, wondering exactly where things were going to fall and where it was going to be aligned. And they were making adjustments to fit within the remaining dollars of the $374 million.
Gotcha.
So I don't know if that helps or confuses, but
No, but that explains it to me because I wasn't understanding the process and how they were eliminating and trying to decide.
and so then the Spark Executive Committee, they created the advisory panels. They named the individuals who are going to serve on those advisory panels, and we had the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House on the Spark Executive Committee. They decided who was going to be serving on those advisory panels. We made the recommendations to the Spark Executive Committee. They made the adjustments. They created the 4 buckets, as it was routinely called. And then their recommendation to the State Finance Council was what was approved.
And then all of that was thrown out.
Ignored.
Representative Howe.
Ooh, thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You may direct this question to whomever you think can answer it the best, but the Office of Recovery, is it funded with state general fund dollars, or is it used with federal?
No, it was funded with federal money.
Okay. How long is the Office of Recovery authorized to operate, or is there an end date prescribed in statute, or is it when all federal dollars are exhausted?
There's nothing in statute for the Office of Recovery. So my anticipation is that we're not going to be receiving any more federal dollars. And I've been criticized for this before in newspapers by saying this, and I hope we do not receive any more federal dollars. And so when all those dollars are out and have expired, it'd be my contention is that the Office of Recovery no longer exists. Unless there would be legislation to continue the Office of Recovery. Representative Powell.
Mr. Chairman, a question for Mr. Belshie. How many FTEs work in the Office of Recovery, and do you feel like you're adequately staffed to handle all the requests?
Ethan.
I believe right now we have 5 filled FTEs. I would have to get back to you on the specifics there, as I'm not in charge of the personnel piece of it. I do feel like we are adequately staffed. We are a pretty lean team, but we have the communications piece, and then we have the program administration piece, and then also the accounting piece. And I do feel we are adequately staffed to meet those needs currently.
Thank you.
And one thing that I would kind of elaborate on is when the Office of Recovery was instigated, it kind of falls under the purview of the Department of Administration. And so there's some shifting that was going on with employees. So it's not like we created an entirely new different department and was staffing that particular department. Representative Estes.
I'm going to take a stab at a question that several people have asked. Representative Tarwater and several others said, hey, our committees did their work. We met, we went through all of them. Our recommendations were ignored. When we have asked you who made the decision, you say the executive committee voted. We're asking you who created the alternative slate that the executive committee was shown.
So that slate was developed with the Office of Recovery, working with various state agencies. And as a part of that process, we did look to the advisory panel recommendations, as I said, and the intent in formulating these proposals was that these proposals or these programs would address those same kind of needs that were identified in the advisory panel's recommendations.
Representative Estes.
So to finally get to a real answer, you're saying the agencies looked at the recommendations and created their own list, and then you guys moved it forward. Is that a fair understanding?
Ethan.
I wouldn't say that the agencies created their own list because, you know, the programs that were developed were not just pulled out of thin air. There were months of, you know, advisory panel meetings, executive committee meetings, and the idea submissions themselves. And so all of that information was taken into consideration in trying to develop proposals.
And
Representative Estes.
And where in the process, because I don't remember the step that you're describing of creating this alternative slate being in what we were originally shown. Is there a place that you remember it that I'm missing?
Ethan.
I'm sorry, can you repeat or rephrase the question?
Representative Estes.
So we were shown last year how this process would work. I do not recall where the Office of Recovery would take such a strong, in conjunction with the agencies, free hand. Where did you see language in what was adopted that gave you guys that power? If so, where did you see that language?
Ethan.
There was no specific language included in the budget bill that spoke to the Office of Recovery's role in the process, but you know, a big part of our role ever since 2020 has been to provide, you know, administrative and organizational support to the Spark process. And I wasn't a part of the Office of Recovery in 2020, but I believe with the CARES CRF funds, a somewhat similar process was undertaken in which agencies and parts of the Spark process were used to kind of formulate proposals or recommendations for how the funds would ultimately be distributed. Of course, with the understanding that Spark itself has the ultimate authority to make the final decisions and to make the final recommendations.
Representative Estes.
I'm going to stop there.
Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've got two questions. The first one, is this then, are these dollars then going to run through the agencies?
Yes, they will be administered by the agencies that are identified in the slide deck on each slide.
All right, thank you. And then it's been asked many different ways, and I will continue to ask it until I get the answer. Who made the ultimate decision to change the process? Either a person or persons. Who made this decision to change this process?
Ethan.
I don't want to hear committee. Who was on that committee that did that? Who are the people that we need to talk to?
So the 7-member Spark Executive Committee was made up of 3 appointees from the governor, and that would be the lieutenant governor, former Secretary of Administration D'Angelo Burns-Wallace, and John Rolfe. The Speaker of the House had 2 appointments, so that would be former Speaker Ron Reichman, and his appointment was Greg Orman. And then it would be the Senate President had 2 appointments, so it would be the Senate President, and Bill Pickert was his appointment.
So 5 people, correct?
7.
7? Okay. So did one of these people or all of these individuals unanimously decide to change this process from what was in the budget bill?
Ethan.
So they abided by the process that was in the budget bill because they made a recommendation to the State Finance Council, which the State Finance Council then approved. There was no deviation from what was statutorily required of the process.
But who made the motion to trash all of the previous recommendations from those committees and make a brand-new one to the Finance Council? Who made that decision? Who made the motion? Who seconded that motion? And was it unanimous from the 7? If you don't know that today, it needs to come back to this committee by tomorrow, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I would have to review the meetings to see exactly how the motions were made, but happy to get that information back to the committee.
Okay. If I could, Mr. Chairman.
You may.
Amy, could you see if we can find the minutes for some of those meetings out there, please?
There was no minutes.
No minutes?
It was video recordings of all the meetings, but I don't
No
think there's
minutes?
I don't think there's any minutes recorded. Yeah. 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 And Jill, Coma didn't require minutes to be taken. Representative Tarwater and then Estes, and then we're going to move on to the next item on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regard to the last statement there from Representative, the members on that committee were left in the dark, and this was their only option to vote on, and they were very frustrated. I've spoken to most of them, or several of them anyway, and I think if you reach out to them, they'll tell you the same thing. And in answer to Representative Corbett's question earlier, we had a post-audit done on the distribution of funds. There were $34 billion given to the state of Kansas. That does not include the PPP loans and the personal items that were dispersed. $34 billion that we went through as a state. My question is, what is the timeline for the application process for this new program?
So it'll vary based on program to program in terms of when each one can be stood up and those applications will open. We've committed to getting information out to the public around when those applications will open by the end of February for the entire slate of programs.
So the announcement will be in February, and how long will people have to fill out applications and get them in?
Ethan?
One piece of the executive committee's recommendations was to ensure adequate time for response to these programs. So what was proposed in the meeting, I believe, was 4 to 6 weeks at a minimum.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, so it sounds like we have time to do other things if we wanted to in this committee to circumvent that process. I mean, it makes total sense to me that big government would make decisions on economic development rather than have highly intelligent business people and eco-devo minds that met all year long come up with the solutions. But I think we can come up with better solutions in this room. Thanks.
Representative Estes.
Was the executive, I'm following on what Representative Tarwater said in the previous questions. From what I hear him saying, the executive committee was not given the full work product, and they were shown a document, and that's the only thing they had. Was the executive committee shown the full work product of each of the advisory committees, yes or no?
Yes. There were meetings in April where each of the advisory panels presented their slate of recommendations to the executive committee. The leadership of each panel did give a presentation on what their recommendations were.
Okay, so then you get to another meeting where a slate is put in front of the executive committee. Who put that slate together?
The Office of Recovery, working with the state agencies, formulated those proposals. In September, the executive committee made a recommendation for the general allocation into the 4 buckets. So that was the 35 to connectivity, 109 to health and education, 100 to efficiency and modernization, and the remainder into economic revitalization. Then in December, with those numbers for each bucket in mind, that's when the program proposals were presented to the executive committee to operationalize those bucket level recommendations.
And what percentage, I'm trying to get a sense of how strongly the advisory committees were ignored. What percentage of what they recommended came to fruition?
All of it.
I couldn't put a percentage on it, but I can say that the advisory panel recommendations certainly were reviewed and were a part of the process of putting together those proposals that were presented and subsequently approved in December.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and move on to something more interesting, and that's the docking state building and the KDHE lab. So I would, yeah. So I'm going to ask Frank Burnham, with the Director of Facilities and Property Management of the Department of Administration, to give us an update on the construction of the docking state office building and the KDHE lab. Frank?
Sure. Again, Frank Burnham, Director of Facilities, Kansas Department of Administration. We issued a construction contract on the docking building to Hutton Construction on November 23rd. That was after an RFP qualification-based selection process. They adopted the bridging documents that were created that established the basis of design, size, square footage, and so forth. The fencing of the project site went up on January 1. The fencing includes screening of the renderings of what the building will look like, general information on schedule, the image and other forth for general public and communication. That will eventually wrap all 4 sides of the site. Harrison Street has been closed in order to facilitate the demolition and removal of the products and materials. That will remain closed through the duration of the project. We've been working with our partners, the City of Topeka. We developed an alternative traffic plan that was approved by the city and continue to work with our local partners. The contractor is using roughly 87% Kansas-based trades and materials. Currently, the asbestos abatement of the upper floors, that's the flooring material, the carpeting, everything is being gutted and removed and pulled out the east side. That work will continue. The first floor is about 60 to 70% gutted, at which point they will lay a roofing membrane over the entire first floor and put in an internal drainage system, which will then allow us to do selective demolition with a tower crane beginning in March of the structure itself. You also see crates in which they will start taking off roughly 40,000 square feet of limestone that'll be retained and shipped to processing facilities here locally in Kansas that will hold, clean, and reuse that material in the new design for cladding. We will do the same with the greenstone material and some of the marble. So as much material that can be salvaged and reused will be. Again, as I stated, the physical deconstruction of the crane is scheduled for roughly March. We're looking at about a 10-month process for the demolition, at which point the reconstruction will now include a 3-story building from grade up with 20-foot floor heights. It's, as most people have seen the design at this point, it's a combination of state agency use space, general public space, exhibit space, and some hospitality type spaces, including a ballroom type auditorium space that'll seat up to 300 people that can be used for state use. We have completed the relocation of the staff. That's the OFPM staff and the highway patrol. They're now physically moved out of the building. So the only remaining people will be the people that serve the state utility power plant, which is underground on the southeast corner. And that's about 4 or 5 people. The completion date, we're still on schedule for June of 2025 at this point. And we continue to work weekly with the design team and the contractor to refine the design, start to establish what might go into those exhibit areas, what opportunities we have to display both permanent and temporary type exhibits, and how this building will serve Kansans, the public, school children, and everybody else that will be visiting our Capitol complex in the future. With that, I will pause on docking building and take any questions before moving on to the laboratory.
Are there any questions for the update on docking? Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there access to a website or something that has kind of like a preliminary floor plan for docking that we could see kind of what's going to be in there?
Yes, I can have the slide presentation of all the design up to this point made public to this committee and distribute. There is also a webcam that went up effective yesterday that will have time-lapse and photos of the entire process that I can provide a link to the members of this committee. We're not necessarily putting that out publicly yet because there's a lot of stuff happening on the site, but at some point everybody will be able to watch the entire process.
Any other further questions in regards to docking State Office Building? Representative Ballard.
Probably I should know, but you indicated that offices of facilities and property management, Highway Patrol have been relocated. Where did Highway Patrol go?
Frank.
They are located in the Capitol complex. That's the central monitoring and dispatch that provides our security. So I'd rather not disclose the physical location, but they've been temporarily relocated for the duration of the project and is standing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions? Oh, Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. On the RFP process, do we know how many contractors submitted bids?
Yes, that was a process that advertised through the Kansas Register. We received 3 firms. Those were McCown Gordon, J.E. Dunn, and Hutton Construction. They went through an extensive multi-month process of being scored on qualifications, at which point their cost proposals were opened, and that was just a percentage of the decision. So in total, we had 3 responding parties.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions for Frank in regards to the docking State Office Building? All right, seeing none, you may now move on to the KDHE lab. Frank.
The KDHE lab is, again, going to be located in the south part of the state parking lot. There's currently fencing around the site. As of about a week ago, there's also a rendering of what the new facility will look like there at the corner, again, to communicate to the public what's coming. That contract was awarded through a construction manager at risk process to McCown Gordon. The way that process works is we're now in the process of putting bid packages out. We just concluded receiving bids for package 1, which would be like your concrete site utilities. That information again goes through the Kansas Register for advertisement and selection. They make a recommendation to the department, and then we award these bid packages. Currently, bid package 2 is out. That's the structural steel. That's the building envelope and the major structural components. We anticipate the end of this month we'll have that information. At that point, roughly 70% of the project will be under what's called GMP, Guaranteed Max Price Contract with the contractor. We do anticipate the dirt asphalt work to begin here in about 2 weeks. That will allow the footings and foundations to start to go into place. And the erection of the vertical construction is on track for May, consistent with what we're anticipating for steel delivery. We are still on schedule for total package delivery by December of 2024 for that facility.
All right. Any questions for Frank in regards to the new KDHE lab? Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. When it's completed in December, then the old facility will be put up for bid for sale, or how will that go about?
We will follow the state process. It would be declared a surplus property, at which point it would be, there'd be an assessment done of value. It would be put up for a public bid. There's roughly 30 acres out there surrounded by the Metro Authority of the airport, and it's a great location for redevelopment to put back on the local tax rolls.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Representative Helgerson.
It's been a while since I've asked this question. Do we find that when we go through the state bidding process and construction process, like you're doing with these 2 buildings, that it costs us more to build a building, or how does it compare? Are there advantages for us to do it, or is it better just to sub it to somebody else?
Frank.
Again, sir, we're managing the process of selecting a vendor. This process worked well given the complexities of these buildings instead of a traditional design it low bid process where you don't get to select that contractor based on their experience. Something like a lab, you really want to have the buy-in. In this case, we had Department of Health and Environment. We had other people at the table interviewing and making that selection. So in this particular case, I think our process was very effective and is going to produce a great project.
Representative Helgerson?
For a state hospital, how would it be? Is it better for us to do it or sub it all out?
By subbing it all out, I'm assuming you're meaning like a private development. We're bound by statute currently to follow our process for delivery of anything that has state dollars. If it's a completely federal funded project, there's other means for delivery, but at this point, this is the only the only roadmap we have.
Thank you.
And I would say we'll have an update on the state hospital proposal for Sedgwick County later on in our committee room, so we can have that particular question.
Is there a state hospital?
Not yet. Representative Howe.
Thank you, Chairman Waymaster. I had a question. What is the process as it relates to termite mitigation? Or is that left up to the contractor?
That would be left up to the contractor and part of their cost and their means and methods.
Does that have to be performed at the docking building renovation or the new lab?
I don't know specifically with the new lab, with that being a state parking lot. I know that there's been exterior or borings done. We've done lots of sampling. We've done lots of subsurface examination. With regard to the docking, the basement and everything is remaining. We're reconstructing that. There's extensive demolition that's going to take place. I am guessing we're also going to be looking at that, but I don't know specifically.
Representative Howe.
Mr. Chairman, if you could get back to me on that, I was just curious. In my off time from the legislature, I'm a certified commercial pesticide applicator, and so I was just kind of curious kind of how the state would approach the pressures of termites, which are quite prevalent in this part of the country. Thank you.
Are there any other further questions for Frank in regards to either the docking state office building or the KDHE lab? Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A little slow there, but could you tell me what the cost is for the new docking building, the estimated cost?
Yes, the construction cost awarded to Hutton Construction was $109,863,000.
Representative Curtis.
And how does that compare with what the proposed rehab cost of the building would have been?
Frank.
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question because there was multiple options presented. In the end, the contractors were given a budget of roughly $109 million. We received $109 all the way up to $138 million. So in this case, the contractor that scored the best in the previous categories was also the low bid, which worked out in our favor.
Thank you.
Any other further questions? All right, see none. Thank you, Frank, for giving us an update on the docking state office building and the new KDHE lab. Committee, you should have been receiving through email the joint meeting follow-up from last Thursday when we had the director of the budget, Director Profit, meeting with our committee and also with Senate Ways and Means, and then you also should have received an updated military and expedited licensure report from the Kansas Legislative Research Department. So until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., we are adjourned.